While every major news outlet is covering the dramatic capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and debating whether the invasion was justified or how it will affect regional politics, almost nobody is talking about what's happening right now behind closed doors. The quiet transfer of control over 303 billion barrels of oil worth $24 trillion, the largest proven oil reserves on planet Earth, and this silent takeover is happening so smoothly that most Americans have no idea it's occurring, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how the United States is taking control of Venezuelan oil without announcing it, why the media focuses on Maduro and democracy while ignoring the $24 trillion asset transfer happening simultaneously, who specifically is benefiting from this quiet takeover with names of companies and individuals getting access to oil contracts, and why this matters more than almost anything else happening in the world right now, because whoever controls Venezuela's 303 billion barrels controls global oil prices, controls energy security for the entire Western Hemisphere, and holds leverage over every country that needs oil. And if you think this is just another foreign policy story that doesn't affect you, consider that the price you pay for gasoline, the inflation rate destroying your purchasing power, and America's ability to maintain the dollar as the world's reserve currency all depend on controlling oil, and Venezuela just became the most important piece on that chessboard. So subscribe right now, because this channel is one of the very few places you'll get the full economic story behind the headlines, the follow-the-money analysis that mainstream media either doesn't understand or deliberately ignores. And if you value understanding what's really happening in the world rather than the sanitized version you're fed, hit that subscribe button, because we're going deep. Before we explain how the United States is quietly taking control of $24 trillion in Venezuelan oil, we need to understand exactly what Venezuela has and why it's worth going to war over. Because the numbers are so staggering, they explain everything. Venezuela has 303.8 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, according to the latest OPEC data from 2024. This is not estimated or speculative reserves. This is proven reserves, meaning oil that has been located, measured, and confirmed to be extractable with current technology, and 303 billion barrels makes Venezuela the country with the largest proven oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia, which has 297.5 billion barrels, larger than Canada, which has 168 billion barrels, larger than Iraq, Iran, Russia, or any other country. Venezuela literally has more accessible oil underground than anywhere else on Earth. Now let's calculate what this is worth. At current oil prices of approximately $80 per barrel, which is the recent average, 303 billion barrels multiplied by $80 equals $24.2 trillion. That's the total value of Venezuela's proven oil reserves at today's prices. And to put 24 trillion in perspective, that's roughly equal to the annual GDP of the entire United States. It's 2/3 of the US federal debt, which is 36 trillion. It's more than the combined market capitalization of Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and every other tech giant combined. $24 trillion is an almost incomprehensible amount of wealth sitting in the ground in one country. And importantly, this calculation is conservative. If oil prices rise to $100 per barrel, which has happened repeatedly in the past 2 decades, Venezuela's reserves would be worth over $30 trillion. And if we're in an energy crisis or major war that spikes prices to $150 per barrel, like we saw in 2008, we're talking about $45 trillion in value. This is why Venezuela matters, not because of Maduro, not because of democracy or human rights or any of the reasons given in press conferences, but because controlling the world's largest oil reserves means controlling the most strategically important commodity on planet Earth, the commodity that powers every military, runs every economy, and determines which countries have power and which countries don't. Here's why the media isn't talking about the oil and why this takeover is happening quietly rather than openly. And understanding this reveals how modern empire actually works. If the United States government or major American media outlets explicitly said, "We're invading Venezuela to take control of $24 trillion in oil reserves," there would be massive domestic and international backlash. Even Americans who support a strong military would be uncomfortable with openly declaring, "We're going to war for oil." It sounds too mercenary, too much like the Iraq War, which remains deeply unpopular. And internationally, it would confirm every criticism from China, Russia, and the global South that America is an imperial power that invades countries to steal resources. So instead, the operation is framed in moral terms. Maduro is a dictator. He stole elections. He's oppressing his people. Venezuelans are starving. We need to restore democracy and human rights. And all of this has elements of truth, which makes it effective propaganda. Maduro is authoritarian. Elections have been questionable. People are suffering. But none of that explains why Venezuela gets invaded, while North Korea, which is far more brutal and has nuclear weapons, doesn't get invaded, or why Saudi Arabia, which is an absolute monarchy with terrible human rights, remains America's ally. The difference is strategic resources. Venezuela has the oil, the others don't or are already cooperating. So the oil takeover happens quietly in parallel with the loud public narrative about democracy. While cameras show Maduro in handcuffs and politicians give speeches about freedom, corporate lawyers are in back rooms drafting contracts. Oil company executives are meeting with whatever government gets installed in Caracas, and State Department officials are negotiating the legal frameworks that will allow American companies to develop Venezuelan oil fields, and this happens away from cameras, in conference rooms through diplomatic channels that don't make headlines. And by the time the public becomes aware that American oil companies are operating in Venezuela, it will be presented as a done deal, a natural consequence of regime change, just business, nothing to see here. This is how every major resource grab works. The military operation is loud and justified with humanitarian rhetoric, while the economic takeover is quiet and justified with legal paperwork. And most people never connect the two because the media focuses on the spectacle of invasion and capture while ignoring the boring details of oil contracts and production sharing agreements. But that's where the real story is. That's where the $24 trillion changes hands. Let me show you exactly who is quietly positioning to benefit from Venezuelan oil and how we know this will happen based on the historical pattern. Because the same playbook has been used before. In Iraq, after the 2003 invasion, there was a period of chaos and insurgency that lasted years, and during that chaos, while media covered car bombs and sectarian violence, the Iraqi government installed by the United States quietly auctioned off oil field development contracts, and the winners of those auctions were ExxonMobil, which got the West Qurna field, BP, which got Rumaila field, Shell, which got Majnoon field, Chevron, which got contracts in Kurdistan, and other Western oil companies. These companies had been shut out of Iraq since Saddam Hussein nationalized oil in the 1970s, but after regime change, they got access again through contracts that last 20 to 30 years. And while these are presented as service contracts where Iraq retains ownership, the companies control operations and get profit shares, effectively controlling Iraqi oil production. In Libya, after the 2011 NATO intervention that killed Muammar Gaddafi, a similar process occurred. During the civil war and chaos, oil contracts were renegotiated, and companies like Eni from Italy, Total from France, and American firms got new concessions or had old ones restored. Gaddafi had been moving toward nationalizing oil and demanding better terms for Libya. After his death, the new government was more accommodating to Western companies. Now in Venezuela, the exact same pattern is unfolding, and we can predict who will benefit by looking at who lost assets when Hugo Chavez nationalized oil in the 2000s. ExxonMobil had major projects in the Orinoco Belt, Venezuela's largest oil region. These were seized by Chavez in 2007. ExxonMobil sued Venezuela in international court and won a $1.6 billion arbitration award in 2014. But Venezuela never paid, and Exxon lost access to fields worth far more than $1.6 billion. So ExxonMobil has been waiting 17 years to get back into Venezuela, and you can be absolutely certain their lawyers and executives have been in contact with U.S. government officials about post-Maduro opportunities. Chevron is different. Chevron maintained a presence in Venezuela even under Chavez and Maduro through joint ventures with PDVSA, the state oil company, but production was limited and Chevron operated under restrictions. With a new government friendly to the U.S., Chevron will want to expand operations dramatically and renegotiate terms to be more favorable to them rather than to Venezuela. ConocoPhillips is another big player. They had assets nationalized and won the largest arbitration award ever against Venezuela, $8.7 billion in 2018. Venezuela hasn't paid, so ConocoPhillips will be demanding either payment or new contracts as compensation. Likely they'll take new contracts because operating Venezuelan fields is worth far more than $8 billion long-term. These three companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips, plus likely Shell, BP, and others, will quietly negotiate contracts over the next months and years, and the contracts will be structured as production sharing agreements or service contracts, where Venezuela technically retains ownership, but the companies control operations and get substantial profit shares. Typically in these arrangements, the company gets 20 to 40% of production or profits, while the host government gets 60 to 80%, but the company has operational control, which means they decide production levels, investment, and development, and operational control is what matters strategically. Here's the mechanism of how oil control transfers from Venezuela to the United States without explicitly calling it a takeover, and why this structure allows plausible deniability. First, a new Venezuelan government will be installed quickly, likely led by someone the United States has already selected, possibly Juan Guaidó, who was recognized as interim president in 2019, or another opposition figure. This government will be portrayed as democratic and legitimate. They'll be sworn in, probably at a ceremony attended by U.S. officials, and they'll immediately request American assistance to stabilize the country and restart the economy. This request legitimizes everything that follows. Second, the new government will desperately need money. Venezuela's economy has collapsed. Oil production is down to about 500,000 barrels per day from a peak of 3 million barrels per day. In the late 1990s, infrastructure is deteriorated. PDVSA, the state oil company, is technically bankrupt, and the government will need massive investment to restart production. So they'll seek foreign investment, and the only countries with oil companies capable of investing tens of billions are the US and allies. Third, contracts will be negotiated that give American companies access to develop oil fields in exchange for investment and technology. These contracts will be structured carefully. Venezuela will technically retain ownership of the oil in the ground. This is important legally and politically because it means the oil wasn't stolen or confiscated, but the contracts will give companies the right to extract, sell, and profit from the oil for 20 to 30-year periods, and the companies will get favorable terms because Venezuela is desperate. They might get 30 to 40% profit shares instead of the 20% that's standard, or they might get guarantees that Venezuela won't change tax rates or royalties, basically locking in advantages. Fourth, production will ramp up dramatically with American investment and technology. Venezuela has the oil but lacks the expertise and capital to extract it efficiently. Heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt requires advanced extraction and refining technology that PDVSA no longer has, so production could increase from 500,000 barrels per day to 2 or 3 million barrels per day within a few years if properly developed, and all this increased production will flow primarily to American refineries or allies. Fifth, the legal structure will ensure long-term control. Even if a future Venezuelan government wants to nationalize oil again like Chavez did, the contracts will have international arbitration clauses and will be governed by New York or London law rather than Venezuelan law, and any attempt to break the contracts will result in billions in arbitration awards and asset seizures globally. Venezuela learned this lesson already with the $8 billion ConocoPhillips award they can't escape, so future governments will be locked in. This is how you take control of $24 trillion in oil without technically seizing it. You install a friendly government, they invite you in. You negotiate contracts that give you operational control and profit shares for decades. You invest to increase production, which makes you indispensable, and you lock in the arrangement through international legal structures that make it nearly impossible to undo, and at no point does anyone say we took Venezuela's oil. Instead, the narrative is we're helping Venezuela develop its resources, we're investing, we're creating partnership, but the result is the same. American companies control Venezuelan oil for the foreseeable future. What would you do if you discovered that the largest transfer of resource wealth in modern history is happening right now? That $24 trillion in oil, more valuable than the entire economy of most countries, is quietly moving from Venezuelan control to American control. and that this is being accomplished not through outright confiscation like colonial empires used to do, but through a sophisticated legal and corporate structure that allows plausible deniability, and that the media is completely missing this story because they're focused on the dramatic military spectacle while ignoring the boring economics happening simultaneously. This is how modern empire operates. It's not crude and obvious like 19th century colonialism. It's refined and technical, done through contracts and corporate structures and international law, but the outcome is the same. Resources flow from weak countries to powerful countries, and wealth is transferred on a scale that would make the robber, barons of the Gilded Age, jealous. If you're starting to understand that the Venezuela invasion is fundamentally about oil, not democracy, that $24 trillion is worth any cost, including war, and that the quiet transfer of control to American companies is more important than anything being discussed on the news, then you need to subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of analysis you won't get anywhere else. Mainstream media won't connect these dots because many journalists don't understand the economics, or because their corporate owners don't want this story told clearly. And while you might find pieces of this story scattered across business publications and oil industry journals, nobody is putting it all together and explaining what it means except channels like this one. So click that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because we're going to follow this story as it develops. We're going to track which companies get which contracts. We're going to show you the documents when they become public. We're going to explain exactly how much money is being made and by whom, because this is the biggest economic story of the year, and most people are going to miss it completely unless they're watching content like this. So subscribe now and hit the like button too, because that helps this video reach more people who need to understand what's actually happening in Venezuela. Here's exactly how controlling Venezuelan oil gives the United States strategic advantages that go far beyond the $24 trillion value, and why this matters for global power dynamics over the next 50 years. First, energy independence for the Western Hemisphere. The United States currently imports about 8.5 million barrels of oil per day, and while domestic production has increased through fracking, the U.S. remains dependent on global oil markets and vulnerable to supply disruptions from the Middle East, Russia, or other unstable regions. By controlling Venezuelan production, which could reach 3 million barrels per day, the U.S. secures a reliable nearby source that can't be cut off by hostile powers. And this isn't just about oil for America, it's about supplying allies in Latin America and Europe, creating an oil bloc that doesn't depend on OPEC or Russia. This is energy security at a continental scale. Second, leverage over global oil prices. OPEC has controlled oil prices for decades by coordinating production cuts and increases among member states. Saudi Arabia, as the largest OPEC producer, has been the swing producer, meaning they can increase or decrease output to move prices up or down. But if the United States controls Venezuelan oil production, in addition to being the world's largest producer through its own shale oil, suddenly the US has equal or greater swing capacity than Saudi Arabia. This means the US can flood the market to crash prices if it wants to hurt Russia or Iran, whose economies depend on high oil prices, or it can restrict supply to raise prices if it wants higher revenue. This is enormous geopolitical leverage. Third, protecting the petrodollar system. Since 1974, when Henry Kissinger negotiated the deal with Saudi Arabia, oil has been priced in dollars, meaning every country needs dollars to buy oil. And this creates artificial demand for dollars that allows the US to print money without immediate inflation, because dollars are absorbed globally. But this petrodollar system has been under threat. China has been buying oil from Russia in yuan. Saudi Arabia has discussed accepting yuan for oil. Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro sold oil to China in yuan and even created a cryptocurrency, the petro, to bypass dollars. All of this threatens to erode the petrodollar, which would be catastrophic for the US because it would mean the Federal Reserve can't print trillions anymore without causing hyperinflation. By taking control of Venezuelan oil, the US ensures that 303 billion barrels, the world's largest reserves, will only be sold in dollars for the foreseeable future. This shores up the petrodollar system at exactly the moment it was weakening. Fourth, denying resources to strategic competitors. China had invested over $60 billion in Venezuela through oil for loans deals. Venezuela owed China somewhere between $15 to $20 billion and was repaying through oil shipments. With the US takeover, Those deals are likely cancelled or severely modified. China loses access to Venezuelan oil and loses the money they lent. This is a major strategic defeat for China in the competition for global resources. Similarly, Russia had been cooperating with Venezuela on oil projects and arms sales. That relationship is now terminated. So controlling Venezuelan oil isn't just about gaining an asset, it's about denying that asset to rivals. Fifth, reshaping Latin American geopolitics. Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro was the anchor of the Latin American left, providing cheap oil to Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and other allied countries through programs like PetroCaribe. This allowed left-wing governments to survive despite economic problems, with Venezuela flipped to US control. That support network collapses. Cuba will face even more severe energy shortages. Nicaragua and Bolivia will have to accommodate to US interests to get oil, and the entire political balance in Latin America shifts rightward. This is regime change not just in Venezuela, but indirectly across the region. Let me show you the specific numbers on how much money American oil companies stand to make from Venezuelan oil. Because when people understand the scale of profit we're talking about, it becomes very clear why this is worth any political or military cost. Let's use conservative assumptions. If US companies get contracts that give them 30% of production and profits, which is a reasonable estimate based on Iraq contracts, and if Venezuelan production returns to 2 million barrels per day, which is below the historical peak but achievable with investment, then we can calculate the annual revenue. 2 million barrels per day times 365 days equals 730 million barrels per year, times $80 per barrel equals $58 billion in annual oil sales from Venezuela, and 30% of $58 billion equals $17.4 billion per year flowing to American oil companies. Now spread that among 3 or 4 major companies. ExxonMobil might get $5 billion per year, Chevron might get $4 billion, ConocoPhillips and others split the rest, and these aren't one-time payments. These are annual revenues that continue for 20 to 30 years, under the contract terms. So over a 30-year period, we're talking about $150 billion for Exxon, $120 billion for Chevron, and similar amounts for other players. And remember, this is using conservative assumptions. If production reaches 3 million barrels per day, which was Venezuela's peak, and if oil prices rise to $100 per barrel, which has happened repeatedly, then the annual revenue is $109 billion, and the 30% share is $33 billion per year for American companies. Over 30 years, that's nearly $1 trillion. And this is why oil companies fund think tanks and lobbying efforts and political campaigns, because the return on investment is astronomical. Spending a few $100 million on political influence to get contracts worth $1 trillion is the best investment you could possibly make. Here's how you can verify this is happening even though it's being done quietly, because there are documents and public records that will show the pattern if you know where to look. First, watch for State Department announcements about economic assistance to Venezuela. These will be framed as humanitarian aid or development assistance, but buried in the details will be mentions of energy sector reform or private sector engagement in oil. This is coded language for oil contracts. Second, watch oil company earnings calls and SEC filings. Publicly traded companies like Exxon and Chevron have to disclose major contracts and investments to shareholders, so in their quarterly earnings calls over the next year, executives will start mentioning Venezuela. They'll say things like, "We're exploring opportunities in Venezuela," or "We're in discussions with Venezuelan authorities." This is how it becomes public. Third, watch for arbitration settlements. ConocoPhillips is owed $8.7 billion by Venezuela. If suddenly that arbitration is settled with ConocoPhillips accepting new contracts instead of cash payment, that's proof the takeover is happening. Fourth, watch oil production data from Venezuela. If production suddenly starts climbing from 500,000 barrels per day toward 1 or 2 million, that means foreign investment and technology is flowing in, and that investment is coming from American companies. Fifth, watch the secondary indicators. Oil service companies like Halliburton and Schlumberger will start getting contracts in Venezuela. These companies provide the technology and services for oil extraction, and if they're working in Venezuela, that means major oil companies are there too. If you follow these markers over the next 6 to 12 months, you'll see the pattern emerge, And you'll watch in real time as control of $24 trillion in oil quietly transfers from Venezuela to American corporate control. And almost nobody in the mainstream media will explain what you're seeing because they're either not paying attention or don't want to tell the story that clearly. Here are the arguments defenders make for why this isn't a takeover or why it's actually good, and why every argument is either dishonest or misses the point. They'll say Venezuela retains ownership of the oil, so nothing was taken, and technically this is true. Under the contracts, Venezuela will own the oil in the ground. But ownership without control is meaningless. If American companies control extraction, control production levels, control where the oil is sold, and take 30 to 40% of the profits for 30 years, then the practical reality is American control, even if the legal title says Venezuelan ownership. This is like saying you own your house, but someone else lives in it rent-free and you can't enter without their permission. The legal title is yours, but they control it. They'll say, this is just investment and development. Venezuela needs foreign capital and expertise to develop its oil, and American companies are simply filling that need in a mutually beneficial arrangement. And again, there's partial truth here. Venezuela does need investment, but the reason Venezuela needs investment is partly because US sanctions destroyed their economy and prevented them from getting parts and technology. So first you crush their economy with sanctions, then you invade and remove their government. Then you offer to invest, but only on terms extremely favorable to your companies, and you call this helping. It's like a loan shark who breaks someone's legs and then offers to lend them money for medical bills. They'll say American companies are taking all the risk. They're investing billions with no guarantee of return, so they deserve high profit shares. But this argument ignores that the risk is largely created by US government actions. Companies are taking risk in Venezuela because the US government removed the previous government and installed a friendly one. And if that new government tries to change the contracts, the US government will protect the companies through arbitration and, if necessary, military pressure. So the companies have risk, but it's backed by the most powerful military on earth. That's not normal business risk. They'll say this is better for Venezuelans than having Maduro in charge. Venezuelan production was collapsing. People were starving. At least with American investment, there will be jobs and economic growth, and this might be true in the short term. But it ignores that Venezuelans won't control their own most valuable resource. The oil revenue that could fund education, healthcare, infrastructure will instead go 30 to 40% to foreign companies, and the rest to whatever government the US keeps in place. And historically, when a country doesn't control its own resources, it remains poor and dependent no matter how much is extracted. This is the resource curse that has affected every oil state that let foreign companies control production. The final lesson about how the United States is quietly taking control of $24 trillion in Venezuelan oil is that this is how modern geopolitics actually works. Not through the official narratives about democracy and human rights, but through control of strategic resources, using whatever means necessary, including military force, and understanding this pattern allows you to predict future events and see through propaganda. Every major US military intervention in the past 30 years has involved countries with oil or other critical resources. Iraq has oil and was invaded. Libya has oil and was bombed. Syria has oil and there's been intervention. Iran has oil and faces constant threats and sanctions. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves and just got invaded. Meanwhile, North Korea, which is far more brutal and actually has nuclear weapons, isn't invaded because they have nothing we want. And Saudi Arabia, which is an absolute monarchy with terrible human rights, is a close ally because they cooperate on oil. The pattern is undeniable. Interventions happen where there are resources worth taking, and the official justifications are selected after the fact to make it palatable. The quiet nature of the oil takeover is essential to maintaining plausible deniability. If it was announced openly that American companies are taking control of Venezuelan oil, even people who support the invasion might feel uncomfortable. It's too obviously about profit and empire. So instead, the military action is loud and justified with humanitarian rhetoric, while the economic takeover happens quietly through boring mechanisms like contracts and arbitration that don't make headlines. And by the time the public realizes what happened, it's a done deal and seems normal. This same pattern will repeat in the future. Whenever you see the US government or media suddenly focusing on a dictator somewhere, Ask yourself what resources that country has. If they have oil, minerals, water rights, strategic location, then the outrage might be genuine, but it's also convenient. And you should expect that if intervention happens, there will be a quiet economic component that involves American companies gaining control of whatever valuable thing that country has. Knowing this pattern doesn't make you a conspiracy theorist. It makes you someone who pays attention to history and patterns rather than accepting official narratives at face value. Now you understand exactly how the United States is quietly taking control of $24 trillion in Venezuelan oil through a sophisticated legal and corporate structure that allows plausible deniability. You understand that while media focuses on Maduro's capture and debates about democracy, the real story is the transfer of control over 303 billion barrels, the world's largest proven oil reserves, to American companies through contracts that will last 20 to 30 years. And you understand the specific companies that will benefit, including ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips, which lost assets under Chavez and have been waiting for exactly this opportunity to regain access. And you understand the mechanism of how control transfers through installing a friendly Venezuelan government that requests American assistance, negotiating contracts that technically preserve Venezuelan ownership but give American companies operational control and 30 to 40% profit shares, and locking in these arrangements through international law that makes them nearly impossible for future Venezuelan governments to undo. And you understand why this is being done quietly rather than openly, because explicitly saying we invaded to take oil would create domestic and international backlash. So instead, the military intervention is justified with humanitarian rhetoric, while the economic takeover happens simultaneously through boring legal mechanisms that don't make headlines. And you understand the strategic advantages this gives the United States, including energy independence for the Western Hemisphere, leverage over global oil prices, protection of the petrodollar system, denial of resources to China and Russia, and reshaping of Latin American geopolitics. And you understand that this is the largest transfer of resource wealth in modern history, larger than any colonial conquest, done not with 19th century methods of crude confiscation, but with 21st century methods of contracts and legal structures, but achieving the same result, which is resources flowing from weak countries to powerful countries, and wealth concentrated in the hands of those who already have power. If this explanation of how $24 trillion in Venezuelan oil is being quietly transferred to American control has made you realize that understanding economics and following the money is more important than following political theater, that the boring contracts and corporate deals matter more than the dramatic military operations shown on TV, and that this channel provides analysis you literally cannot get from mainstream media, which either doesn't understand these mechanisms or deliberately avoids explaining them this clearly. Then you need to subscribe immediately. And here's why subscribing matters more than you might think. YouTube's algorithm promotes videos based on engagement. When you subscribe and turn on notifications, you're telling YouTube that this content is valuable and should be shown to more people, and every subscriber helps this channel grow and reach a larger audience, which means more people understand what's really happening instead of believing the sanitized narrative. And this matters because public understanding affects what governments can do. If enough people understand that the Venezuela intervention is fundamentally about oil, it becomes harder to do the next one using the same playbook. Knowledge is power and spreading. This analysis is how you fight back against propaganda. More importantly, subscribing to this channel helps us continue making this content. YouTube monetizes videos based on watch time and subscriber count. Channels with more subscribers get better ad rates and can invest more in research and production, and every single subscriber contributes to that. So when you subscribe, you're not just staying informed yourself, you're helping build independent media that isn't controlled by the corporations and government interests that want to keep these stories hidden. And if you think independent analysis like this is valuable, if you think people deserve to know how $24 trillion is being transferred and who's profiting, then subscribing is the most effective action you can take right now. So click that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss an upload, and help us reach 100,000 subscribers, which is the threshold where this channel can expand significantly, hire researchers, improve production quality, and do even deeper investigations into how money and power really work. because the Venezuela story is just one example of a pattern that repeats constantly, and this channel is dedicated to exposing that pattern again and again until enough people understand how the system actually operates. And if you've watched this far, 21 minutes deep into an analysis of Venezuelan oil contracts, then you're exactly the kind of person who should be subscribed, because you clearly care about understanding the world at a deeper level than headlines. You're willing to invest time to learn how things really work, and you deserve a media source that respects that and gives you the full story. So subscribe now, like this video, to help it reach more people, and share it with anyone you know who wants to understand what's actually happening in Venezuela, because this is the story of 2026, and almost nobody is covering it honestly.